What up, Wizards? It's Dev from The Place with some Pauper content for you because nobody likes Standard. It's true. I decided to put a little Pauper video up on the Patreon poll and it smashed the competition. This thing got nearly double the number of votes as the second place deck in that poll, and I shouldn't be too surprised because the last time I dove into Pauper, that video ended up getting like almost 200k views, which is weird. Thanks, I guess. But I also shouldn't be surprised because every time I look into Pauper myself, I'm reminded that it's kind of the best way to play Magic the Gathering. I know that sounds super subjective because it is, but it's just got everything I want in a Magic format, right? First of all, I like to play classic, vintage power level Magic cards I've been trying to cast since I was 12 years old. Check, Pauper's got plenty of those, but I also think there should be room in a format sometimes for newer cards to come in and make a splash from time to time, and Pauper's got that. There are cards from Edge of Eternities in this video. That's pretty new as I record this, but also I think that it's nice when a format makes room for unknown, almost unheard of cards to come in and do weird stuff, and sometimes base entire new strategies around we've never seen before. Check, Pauper's got a bunch of those too. And finally, of course, the budget, right? Like every deck in this video can be gotten for around like $100 at most, and in most cases, much, much less than that. So Pauper's just kind of got it all going on right now, and beyond that, it's really healthy at the moment too. I could have chosen like 15 decks for this video, all of which have a pretty decent meta share and do stuff on any given Sunday, but I had to pare it down to just 5. So let's do that. Let's look at 5 Pauper decks that can win you games in 2025/2026. Depends on when you're watching this. Roll the intro.
And I'm your favorite Magic Channel's favorite Magic Channel. Best believe that the professor go bananas for my deck tech.
And we're back, ready to go ahead and start. Let's begin by dipping our toes into a deck that everybody already knows. Nowadays, we're calling this thing Grixis Madness, but make no mistake, this is just mono red burn in a fancy costume. Now, this is a deck that's existed in Pauper since basically day one, and it still keeps up with the big boys. As a matter of fact, it is currently tied for the most played deck in the format. In terms of meta share, this thing sits at 11.9% currently, which is kind of a lot of people on this deck, and it's easy to see why. It's classic, it's easy to pilot, it still keeps up, and it's actually the cheapest deck you can play in Pauper, about $20 on TCG Player for this stinking thing. And even if you bump it up and go with the Card Kingdom option, it's like $50 for this deck, which is a freaking steal for a deck that's going to win Pauper tournaments for you should you choose to enter them. Now, remember what I said about classic Magic cards back there? We start with perhaps the most classic Magic card of all time in Lightning Bolt, but we're also playing Fiery Temper, which is just Lightning Bolt. It's basically just Lightning Bolt. Sometimes we'll hardcast this for 3 mana, but very often we can go ahead and just make it a second copy of Bolt in here because we got lots of ways to discard cards. So you knew we were playing this, but you might have also called that we're playing Lava Dart and Fire Blast as a 4 of and a 3 of respectively. So far, this entire deck, it's like $6, $7, something like that, for some of the best Magic cards in the history of Magic the Gathering. If you've never seen Lava Dart before, it does more damage than you think. And as far as Fire Blast goes, if you were blasting people in like 1998, it's still just as fun now as it was back then, and as effective too. But like I said back there's got to be room for new cards in decks from time to time, and even Mono Red Burn, an old dog like that, can learn new tricks. We've got Voldaren Epicure in the deck, which isn't super new, but you know, last couple of years it kind of counts. There's also Sneaky Snacker in here from a Modern Horizons set. Not a card you'd often see in a mono red deck, but again, this is mono red. There's just 18 mountains in the mana base, and that is it, kids. So we're not looking to hardcast this ever. We're just looking to draw enough cards in a turn to just throw it onto the table. But the deck also gets to do cool spell slingery stuff, like the 4 copies of Kessig Flame Breather and the 3 copies of Gutter Snipe. Behold, the most expensive card in the entire deck, Kessig Flame Breather. You can get a Lightning Bolt for less than this right now, but this is obviously an effective dude along with Gutter Snipe for just piling up the damage over the course of a game. But the final beat when building a burn deck is always going to be card draw. How do you crack that egg? We got 4 copies of Faithless Looting and 4 Grab the Prize to kick things off here. Looting is just always going to be the best common red card draw spell. It doesn't get too much better than that. And Grab the Prize, pretty new card here too, but along with Fiery Temper, this can deal up to 5 damage and draw a couple of cards for you, so you take that. There's also Highway Robbery and Sazakap's Brew in here as a 4 of and a 2 of respectively. You don't need too many brews, but sometimes you'll go ahead and give the opponent a fish when they leave a sneaky snacker unblocked, you'll deal a bunch of damage that way. But Highway Robbery just gives us more options than discarding a card to draw our 2 cards, which again we'll take from time to time, but mostly we're looking to discard tempers and whatnot. Now I've already told you there's 18 mountains in the deck, but I actually won't be going over mana bases in too great a detail, or for that matter, sideboards. But don't worry, you want to see those things. I've got deck lists in the description for everything we talk about today, and the deck list will include those things. We've just got a lot to go over today, and I wanted to take what YouTube deems to be a normal amount of time. So with all that said, overall here, Mono Deck is still the deck it always has been, despite some of the new pieces it's picked up over the years, like Epicure, Grab the Prize, Sneaky Snacker. It still has basically the same play patterns. Don't play too many lands, draw a bunch of cards, burn face, and this is still a surprisingly efficient way to pick up games in 2025 and beyond. And it's really cost effective too as far as your wallet goes, man. Again, this thing costs like as much as a bad standard budget deck, around 20 bucks or so to build right now, and that is a really good cost to just rule Pauper. If you're thinking about, again, dipping your toe into this format, I think that Mono Red is a really good place to start. But let's move on and kind of kick up the intensity a notch in terms of what it actually takes to play a deck. We're going to look at Mono Blue Terror up next, which doesn't have that 11.9% of the meta that Burn does, but it does have 11.6, so that makes it the number 3 deck in the format right now. And even though we're going to do a full code shift at this point, this is like the opposite kind of deck from the first deck. It's still a really cheap deck to play, a fairly easy deck to play, and if you enjoy tempoing your opponents out, this is probably the deck in the format for you. Now it all starts with 4 copies of Tolarian Terror, as you might imagine. That's why the deck is called that, but there's also 4 Cryptic Serpent in here, which is basically copies 5 through 8 of Tolarian Terror. These are really similar cards for all intents and purposes, and you can see why they're good in Pauper, right? In the case of Tolarian Terror, you have a 1 blue mana 5/5 ward too. What are they going to do about that? In Pauper, turns out that that's a really difficult question to answer. We've seen Tolarian Terror tempo decks be pretty decent in Standard over the last couple of years, but when it comes to a format like Pauper, I think that cards like Tolarian Terror are much more likely to rise to the top, and that's what we've seen here. There's a lot of ways to support this card in this deck, but there is one more creature that we're playing. Say it with me, it's Delver's Secrets. We're playing all 4 copies of this card as well, because it's basically a 1 mana 3 power flyer, and that is good in any format. But to play your Terrors and Serpents for super cheap, and to flip over your Delvers, you're going to have to play a lot of instants and sorceries and whatnot, and this deck does that. We've got 2 copies of Ponder to kind of start off the card draw, because there's a ton of 1 mana card draw in this deck. I feel like half of the deck is 1 mana card draw. There's 4 copies of Brainstorm, maybe the best common 1 mana blue card draw spell ever printed, and really it might just be the second best blue card draw spell ever printed behind Ancestral Recall, but who's counting? We've also got 4 copies of Thought Scour in here, and 4 copies of Mental Note. Pretty similar cards in some ways, but Mental Note is kind of expensive for a Pauper deck. It's like $4.25 to get 1 copy of this card right now, and it's mostly just because it's really, really good in this deck. You're going to put a couple of cards in your graveyard, and that'll fuel your Terrors and your all that stuff. So pretty cool little card for this deck specifically. We're looking for a lot of ways to draw a card at 1 mana. Mental Note's basically the absolute best way to do it. But there's also 4 copies of Lorien Revealed in here, which is $3 whole right now, but that's because it's in a ton of Pauper decks and even a fair number of Commander decks at time of writing. So no surprise that this card kind of shot up in value, but it is very effective in this deck, and maybe even in another deck we'll look at a little bit later. But apart from that, we've got even more card draw, like the 2 copies of Deep Analysis, which was once a very, very powerful Magic card in a couple of different formats, but it's mostly relegated to Pauper at this point in its life cycle. That said, Deep Analysis is still pretty good in a deck that's dumping a bunch of cards in its graveyard. You can just pay 2 mana to draw a couple of cards later in the game. We've got Deem Inferior and Sleep of the Dead in here. These are some of the only removal spells or whatever in the entire deck, however you want to classify these. These are basically the only ways to do that, but Sleep of the Dead is more effective than it looks, because it doesn't look very effective at all, but sometimes tapping your opponent's creatures down is better than putting an aura like Unable to Scream or something like that on them, so I can see why a card like this is in the deck. There's also 4 copies of Counterspell. Probably didn't see that one coming, did you? You did. Anyway, there's also 2 copies of Dispel and 2 copies of Spell Pierce to round off the counter magic in this thing. So 8 total counter spells, a lot of which, like Dispel and Spell Pierce, are just going to protect your threats for you. But finally, there's 16 islands. And that's the deck. Now, again, I'm not going super deep on lands here, but you'll note that I said there's 16 islands in this deck, and there's 18 mountains in the first deck. There are extremely low land counts in this format from what I can tell. As a matter of fact, we'll look at a deck later that has 4 lands, and I'm really excited about it. But let's go ahead and move on to the third deck that I want to look at today, a mid-range deck. So we've already looked at a burn deck, a tempo deck, and now we're going to look at what is almost certainly the best mid-range deck in the format, in a lot of ways, just the best deck in the format, I think, right now. Let's go with Jund Wildfire, which also has around 12% of the meta right now and is technically the most played deck in the format. Now, it all starts with 4 copies of Cleansing Wildfire, and I do have to tell you what some of the lands are in the deck for this thing, because we have 8 total copies of Indestructible Dual lands. So the idea is to just target one of those indestructible lands with Cleansing Wildfire, we draw a card, and we basically cast Rampant Growth. We can go get a land and throw it onto the table, even though we didn't lose our land. So that's actually a really, really good play in a format like Pauper. Now, the creature base in this deck is admittedly a little bit wild looking, especially if you didn't know how good Writhing Chrysalis was in its own limited environment. It ruled the roost there, baby, and it turns out it translates pretty well to Pauper too. At first, it just looks like an overcosted 2/3 with a couple of crappy bodies, but those crappy bodies are the 0/1 Eldrazi Scion tokens you can sack for a colorless mana. So we've got a pretty good ramp core in this deck with the Cleansing Wildfire trick and Writhing Chrysalis, and as we sacrifice those Eldrazi tokens, the Writhing Chrysalis will get even bigger, and there's always something to use that ramp on. But there's also 4 copies of Refurbished Familiar in this deck. We do have enough artifacts in this deck to where most of the time this is just going to be a 1-mana 2/1 flyer that makes them pitch a card. If they can't pitch a card, we draw a card. That is really, really good for just a single mana. Again, and it sounds good in just about any format, but especially in a format like Pauper, this thing is gas. I'm having to go over all these creatures one by one because they're kind of weird and unknown if you don't play the Pauper format, but let's look at Quark Clan Shaman. Up next, for that matter, this is a single red mana for a 1/1 Goblin Shaman, sack an artifact, and Quark Clan Shaman deals 1 damage to each creature without flying. So yeah, it'll do away with itself most of the time. You can stack its ability and sacrifice a few different artifacts and take out most of the creatures on the table if you want to sweep her that way. And finally, there's 1, sometimes 2 copies of Nyxborn Hydra, which again looks super duper weird, but in this deck, we're usually just going to bestow onto a big old Chrysalis and rumble in, or we can put it on like a flying Refurbished Familiar and get in for a bunch of flying trample damage. Flample's a good ability, so, you know, again, it looks very weird. It's kind of come down from 2 copies into 1 copy in the most recent list, but it's still hanging on in the deck. But like I said, we're kind of an artifact deck, so we're playing 4 copies of Ichor Wellspring and 2 copies of Blood Fountain. When it comes to Ichor Wellspring, this will draw us a bunch of cards because we have a few different ways of sacrificing artifacts in the deck. And as far as Blood Fountain goes, this is just 2 artifacts for 1 mana, which is really good for a lot of different stuff in the deck. We've got 3 copies of Eviscerator's Insight and 3 copies of Fanatical Offering, which are pretty similar cards here, but both of these also allow us to sacrifice an artifact, thus making things like Wellspring and Blood Fountain worth playing for the most part. But Insight we can flash back in the late game if we get there, and as far as Offering goes, this will also create a map token which can also count as an artifact for certain effects and be further sacrificed and all that. Deck also plays 2 copies of Limbus, mostly for life gain. You know, we've already seen that there's a burn deck in the format, but one of the next decks we'll look at is a combo deck that can hit you for like 22 damage all at one time. So a little bit of life gain goes a long way on a card like Limbus, and it gives us another artifact to sacrifice. There's also 2 copies of Nile's Spellbomb to mess around in graveyards, which again with the deck I'm going to show you next is more relevant than ever. There's 1 copy of Makeshift Munitions to kind of pull all this together. Kind of surprised this card is a common and it's only 10 cents right now. It's a fun card to play, but again, we've got plenty of artifacts in this deck and this can add up to a lot of damage. Last few things to finish the deck off, there's a copy of Pulse of Murasa. Again, life gain's really important in this format, even if it's just a little bit at a time, but this is actually kind of a lot at one time, plus we get some value off of this out of our yard, which is always good. And finally, a couple of removal spells. We got 2 copies of Cast Down, maybe the single best Doomblade in the format, especially with all these monocolored decks running around, but there's also 2 copies of Galvanic Blast. Makes perfect sense to play in a deck like this. We should have Metalcraft at some point in the game, and this just becomes like better than a lightning bolt when that happens. This deck is kind of a lot. It's a few disparate themes that all do come together. You know, you got your weird synergy between Cleansing Wildfire and the Indestructible lands. You've got a kind of artifact theme going on in there. You've got Writhing Chrysalis and Nyxborn Hydra. Like, there's some odd stuff going on in this deck, and at the end of the day it just kind of comes across as like a value mid-range deck with a couple of really strong synergies in it. But I like that kind of deck, man. It feels like a little bit playing a really powerful standard mid-range deck, and I can get down with that. It's got a few different value engines, a couple of different ways of drawing cards, some relatively strong creatures in its package, and some really good removal. So again, end of the day, just kind of straight up and down value town mid-range deck that does a couple of things really, really well. And of course, you can Jund them out, and a lot of people really love Junding them out. Now, this is where the meta share takes a bit of a nosedive, right? We've already looked at the top 3 decks in the format, a couple of 12%ers and one with 11.6% of the meta. But the next deck would be Mono Blue Fairies with 6.4% of the meta, but it's not necessarily a dupe of Tolarian Terror deck, but it's just another take on Mono Blue Tempo. The next deck after that would be Mono Red Aggro, which again isn't necessarily a straight up carbon copy of Mono Red Aggro. It's kind of got an artifact theme going on, so it feels like somebody took the Jund deck and the Mono Red Burn deck and bushed them together, made them kiss, they had a little baby. But again, I felt like that was a little too similar to the Mono Red deck. So I figured what I wanted to do with this video is kind of give an impression of all of the different decks you can play in Pauper, a good spread of diverse decks that you could go out with there any given Sunday, baby. And I've got a deck for you next. It's got about 5% of the meta right now, and it's a little bit hard to tell whether it's an up-and-comer or a deck that was up and coming 2 weeks ago and now everyone's kind of off of. At one point, this was, briefly, the most played deck in Pauper leagues on MTGO, and it's tapered off a bit, but that doesn't make me any less excited for Spy Combo. This deck gets to play Land Grant and Lotus Petal, which gets a little bit expensive, but in some ways it feels like playing a vintage Magic deck that's really powerful, and this is the deck that only plays 4 lands. Let me show you how we get away with that. Now, first of all, what even is the combo? Well, it's Balustrade Spy and Lotlith Giant. You see, Balustrade Spy is going to put most of the cards in our deck into our graveyard because we're only playing 4 lands. Sure, it could hit a land and a few cards, and that would kind of suck, I guess, but for the most part, we have plenty of ways to completely take all of the lands out of our deck. So this will basically hit every card in our deck, and we had a Thassa's Oracle, I guess we could win at that point, but how we're actually going to win at that point is by either casting or in many cases reanimating a Lotlith Giant at that point, and this will hit our opponent for as much damage as we have creatures in our yard, and that'll usually be enough to kill them. And believe it or not, even with our 4 lands, we can pretty easily reanimate the Lotlith Giant because we're doing it for free with Dread Return, which we're playing a couple of copies of in this deck. We can flash this back by sacrificing 3 creatures, and it should end up in our graveyard if we've dumped our entire library into our yard at that point. So should be easy as pie to just cast the Dread Return out of our yard, get the Lotlith Giant back, hit our opponent for 1,000,000, and take the game home. But again, with 4 lands, how do we actually make all that happen? Now, it all starts with 4 copies of Generous Int and 2 copies of Troll of Khazad-dûm, both from the Lord of the Rings set, right? These will Forest Cycle and Swamp Cycle, respectively, meaning that for just 1 mana, you can go and fetch a land, meaning that now you have 2 mana and you can do just about anything in the deck. But actually, most of the deck is ways of finding mana, right? We've got 4 copies of Segu Wildling, another pretty new card here from Tarkir Dragonstorm. This is a Lay of the Land effect that can go get one of our lands for us, which is great, but it also counts as a creature in our graveyard, which is really important. There's 4 copies of Ceruli Caretaker in here, so we can tap down creatures for mana, and this only costs 1 mana to get on the table in the first place. But there's also 4 copies of Gate Creeper Vine in here to go get lands for us for just a couple of mana, and 4 copies of Overgrown Battlement. That's right, this is actually a Defender deck at its heart. There's even 2 copies of Axebane Guardian to do a very similar thing in terms of making mana for us. Once we've got these and maybe 1 or 2 other Defenders on the table, we make all the mana we could ever need. To keep up the Defender theme, we've even got 3 copies of Wall of Roots in here. Again, will make mana, but also is a Defender creature for the couple of creatures that care about that. There's even 2 copies of Kyrion Ranger. If you want to play another card from the olden days, you certainly can. This is a way of generating a bunch of mana by being able to, say, untap a mana-producing creature like your Ceruli Caretaker or whatever, return a forest to your hand, and then play that forest untapped. so you can get even more mana out of it. So Kyrion Ranger, just as good of a trick as it was in 98. Apart from that, we've got stuff like Winding Way in here to help find lands, and if it doesn't help find lands, it just dumps a bunch of cards into our yard, which we will always take. There's also Lead the Stampede in here, which does cost 3 mana, but we will get to it in the late game, and this can find up to 5 freaking cards for us all at one time, which is a deal we'll take every time. We're actually not quite done with creatures in this deck. There's a couple of value guys, like 3 copies of Masked Vandal in the deck, which will take out a couple of key artifacts in the format right now, as well as 2 copies of Mesmeric Fiend, which will dig around in their hand, sometimes for removal spells, but other times for just big stuff they're about to cast. And finally, you will occasionally see a copy of Acorn Harvest in the deck, which technically makes this a 61 card deck when it does show up, but it is always a 61st card. They never cut a card for it, right? The deck is built in a very specific way, but I guess that it doesn't matter if you have 61 cards. Once you get Balustrade Spy down with no lands left in your deck, you could be an 80 card deck. The whole thing's going in your yard anyway, so what does it matter? So long as you can find the spy and the mana to cast it, right? But Acorn Harvest is in here, I'm told, because it is good against Krark Clan Shaman in the Jund deck. Even if Shaman shoots down all of your guys, you can still cast the Harvest out of your graveyard and then sometimes have enough creatures to where you can flash back the Dread Return just off the Acorn Harvest and maybe 1 or 2 other small guys depending on what you're getting. So, good, interesting kind of meta play to play 1 copy of Harvest in the deck, but we've also got 4 Land Grant and 2 Lotus Petal, and those are the last few cards in the deck. Again, notice how much of this deck is dedicated to getting mana, and Land Grant still feels just as good to play as it did back in the day, right? But as far as Lotus Petal goes, you can say the same thing about that, but it makes the deck really expensive. It's like $60 for 2 copies of Lotus Petal, but that said, the deck used to just play 6 lands rather than 4, and Lotus Petal builds have proven to be the more popular and powerful builds because it's easier to dump all of the lands out of your deck if you're playing Lotus Petal instead of 2 extra lands. But if you'd rather not spend 60 extra bucks on this deck and actually spend a reasonable amount to play this thing, you could just cut the Lotus Petals and play 6 lands instead. What an awesome deck. This reminds me a lot of the basically no land Charbelcher deck from a long, long time ago before some of you were even born. We used to have a game called Magic the Gathering. It's a lot of fun, but Pauper in some ways still feels like playing some of those old formats, and this deck is a big contributor to that. I think that combo should exist in a format from time to time, and Pauper does have a number of combo decks, but this has proven to be not just the most popular, but the most effective one over the last few weeks. And even though it's kind of the baby of the video, it's only been out for a few months at this point, it is kind of quickly gaining a foothold in the meta. Well, let's finish things off here with another deck that's kind of climbing up that Pauper rank ladder at this very moment, and that is blue-white something. Blue-white blink, but it only plays like 2 cards that blink. I don't even really know. Blue-white enter the battlefield triggers. I'm not really sure what to call this, but it's basically blue-white value town, and it plays a bunch of cards that I used to love and now again get to play again. That's a common theme in this video, but also it's just a sweet value town deck that could maybe rival the likes of decks like Jund before it's all said and done. This deck has decent mana production, or at least cost reduction in it, and I kind of like that about it, but it's also just got a lot of really good mid and late game engines it can kind of rely on to do cool stuff and put it way up on cards once it gets to the point it needs to get to. So with all that said, let's take a look at a deck that you might not know too much about even if you're a huge Pauper fan. Let's take a look at Azorius. Now it all starts with 4 copies of Sunscape Familiar, which will allow your blue spells to cost 1 less mana. This is one of the only white spells in the deck. There's a couple of other ones. It's not like we're just a completely mono blue deck, but we are very close to one, and Sunscape Familiar is one of the few white cards we want to be playing. This is effectively just a ramp spell in our Azorius deck, which you don't really see enough of, honestly. Now, once we've got our Familiar down, we can much more cheaply play really cool stuff like Mole Drifter and even Seagate Oracle, which is a cool little guy to play, provides us some value, puts a card in our hand, body on the table, whatever. I like that Pauper is still a format where you can get away with playing cards like that. But Mole Drifter really attracted me to this deck. Now, I should tell you this deck only has about 2.3% of the meta right now, which doesn't seem like a whole lot, but again, we got an up-and-comer and it's doing cool stuff like playing Mole Drifter, and any deck that plays Mole Drifter has a piece of my heart. Card-drawn Fish, baby, we all love him, but there's also 2 copies of Archaeomancer and 2 copies of Murmuring Mystic, so it's just a who's who of some of my favorite blue creatures of all time in the deck, which is probably something else that attracted me to it. We get to play Archie in here and repeat value. We sometimes get activate the Blink Archie and bring another spell back from our yard. That's dope. Murmuring Mystic making a bunch of birds for us as the game goes on. That again is exactly the kind of thing that I could get behind. I've built entire $5 decks for the channel around M before, man. This is a dude that I have really got a lot of memories of playing, so here's just a lot of fun dudes in this deck, and it turns out, again, you can get away with stuff like this in Pauper, but there's actually one more creature in the deck, and it's the 4 full copies of God Pharaoh's Faithful. Again, look how important life gain can be in a format like this. God Pharaoh's Faithful has a couple of things it can do, but it's mostly just going to gain us a fair amount of life over most turns, and that'll keep us out of reach of decks like Mono Red Burn. It'll keep us out of reach of decks like Spy Combo, and that's a pretty important thing to have access to. There's also 2 Ephemerate and a Ghostly Flicker in the deck, so 3 total blink effects in the entire deck, despite the fact that we've got a huge number of enter the battlefield triggers on our guys, but we don't need to overdo it on the blink effects. A well-timed one every now and again will win games. As far as card draw, there's the 4 copies of Preordain. I should probably go ahead and let you know about those. This is just another 1-mana card draw spell. It's kind of, you play those in Pauper, I guess, but there's also kind of more interesting cards in here, like the 4 copies of Meeting of Minds. And the 2 Lorien Revealed. We've already seen this card once in this video, so I guess it's not as interesting as it would have been if you hadn't seen it yet. But again, it's a good card, it turns out. But Meeting of Minds is fantastic in this deck because, you know, we've got a fair amount of creatures we don't mind tapping. Stuff like God Pharaoh's Faithful. That's something for it to do if it's not a blocking creature, but we've also got birds from Murmuring Mystic we can tap down. We're not doing too much with Archie in terms of attacking or blocking again, so, you know, tapping it down for Meeting of Minds is pretty easy to do, so really like this effectively sometimes free card draw spell in a deck like this. But apart from that, there's some interaction. We got 3 copies of Snap in here, another card that you'll often see in Pauper decks, just maybe the best blue bounce spell of all time. Let's play a few copies of that. But there's also 2 Prohibit and 2 Foil to bring things home here. These are both the counter spells that the deck plays, and there ain't too much more to say about them. I guess if I did have to say something about them, it would be to point out that Foil is yet another potentially free card in the deck along with Meeting of Minds. So we're not necessarily a tempo deck, but we can still do an awful lot of stuff when we are tapped out, and that can take a lot of opponents by surprise. I'm not sure how many people are actually expecting Foil in 2025. Now I know this deck might not seem like too much to some players out there, but again, I just like that Pauper's the kind of format that's conducive to a deck like this, and 2.3% of the meta may not seem like much, but again, one of the reasons I think it might be an up-and-comer is because this actually just won a pretty well-attended event, the 2nd annual Extra Life Pauper event. This took 1st place at, so again, I think there's something there, and that tournament was only a couple of days ago as I record this video. So again, there might seriously be something here, you know. I think Jun proves that a decent kind of grindy mid-range deck with a couple of different plans it can rely on is actually a pretty decent deck in the format, and this one is a lot like that with less removal options and a lot more card draw options, and I think that's potentially really powerful. That is Itski, Captain Lewitsky. I didn't cover every deck in the format in this video. That would have taken forever. You know, there's stuff like Grixis and Esper Affinity. Elves is still in the format, as you might expect. High Tide combo still doing stuff. Again, you might have seen that coming, but, you know, it turns out that a lot of the decks that have been good in Pauper for a long time are still good in Pauper and have some share of the meta, but I wanted to highlight a couple of really cool decks in this video, along with some of the decks that have the absolute most meta share. So, hope you enjoyed it. If there's anything I didn't cover, let me know in the combat. The combat? It is basically the combat section. The comments section. I play too much Magic. I really do. But anyway, y'all, that's all I've got for this one. And so just let me know how you felt down there. Do all the YouTube stuff on your way out, of course. Make sure you hit the button shaped like a thumb if you enjoyed the content. Spread it around to more people. Subscribe to the channel if you like this stuff. There's going to be more like it at some point, I'm sure. And apart from that, you can always check out the Patreon, which is just $1 a month. And if you felt like I did a good job on this video and you just want to give me like $1, go ahead and, you know, it's $1. What is $1? What is $1 right now? I am. So if you got $1, just burning a hole in your pocket, I guess, you know, and you want to kind of just say thanks for the stuff that we do around here, I would appreciate it. Just go over to the link in the description. You'll probably have to paste it into your address bar. I apologize in advance. But anyway, y'all, that's all I've got for this one, and I appreciate you watching if you got this far. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.